But then let me just go back to the time when I was in university, right? I studied in Mumbai, architecture, and I was very lucky. I had professors who constantly asked me, "But what do you want to do?" Which today is just a question of not just, but it's a question of uh, activating the imagination. We all know, at least my generation had the, like schooling was almost military compared to what we see here in the West, and how people play four instruments and six other skills, and then they become architects. We were doing 13 hours in schools and tuitions to clear our exams and get into universities, basically. And then the imagination had to be sort of, let's say, formally activated, or teachers, our teachers had to sort of say, come on, start dreaming, start thinking. The imagination has a place in not just in terms of capital and sort of, even if you want to be a star architect or whatever, but in terms of society, we, just because things seem smaller than what you see in other parts of the world, doesn't mean they haven't been dreamt of and imagined. These were all dreams, and there are more to come. How do you see this space as a pedagogue, as an architect, as I love this word now throughout our conversation, as a negotiator and observer of a city? How do you see the imagination, and where does it lie? What's its space? What are its problems? Or how what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, as a pedagogue, I would say, I mean, that's also, we see this idea of the school also as a practice, and
Yeah.
really kind of uh, you know really kind of thinking of students also, not as people who are being disciplined, but also kind of companions.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
that's like super important for us, that we see the school as a space of practice of the faculty members who are there, all our colleagues. It becomes a space of practice, because otherwise the school, and that's what has happened with the university over the years, that the school has become a coaching class,
yeah,
right? That you kind of come to impart a certain knowledge that you have, or you already have. There's no space for the imagination there, right?
yeah,
There's
yeah,
no space for new work, new thinking, right? You come from what you've learned, and you come and impart that knowledge, right? But I don't think that's possible anymore, right? That's why in some ways what we see is the school becomes then a space for multiple practices, where the students become companions. And we also urge the students to build a kind of long durée practice for themselves also. And that's where we also kind of are cognizant of the fact that then the project that you do becomes a moment in a long durée practice. So we
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
ask, what is your long question? you
Mm-hmm.
know is there a long question that you have, right? Or are you just moving from project to project? Because if you have those long questions, then those then get, you feed them into the project, or the project sort of feeds off those long questions,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah,
I mean, we also see the school as a cultural space, so it's not only a kind of teaching learning space, but it's also a cultural space for many people to pass through. And so even when we have others visiting the school, I think that's one of the important questions to kind of work with. What is that long question? So we have, every year we have one exhibition that happens. We invite people to bring their work, but to bring that long question to the school. Rather than bringing projects, you bring a long question and you discuss that. You discuss your inquiry with others. So I think that kind of, it's important to spark that kind of space of the imagination. And that's why I think, I mean, one of the things we also say is that research becomes very, very important. you
Mm-hmm.
know because often, and that's what has happened with the architectural space also, that it has become a space where you I mean, it's a kind of space where you learn from precedents, and you kind of replicate them, you reproduce those, right? But where are those even coming from, right? Like,
Yeah,
you will require research to kind of ask those questions, build that kind of I mean, we don't work like many others. Like, if you have to innovate, if you have to come up with new ideas, you require your base, you require your research. So I think that's where the new space also, we call it the Center for Spatial Studies.
yeah,
And it kind of has these three things that we are looking at: the idea of research, the idea of open pedagogy, and the idea of collaborative academia. Because we see ourselves as this kind of network of people who are, thinking together with. Because I don't think you can be like this kind of closed, this independent hero architect
yeah,
anymore.
yeah.
You need to kind of work with your own, work through research, ask new questions, but also kind of collaborate for things. So
I
yeah, I mean, I think what it requires is an institutional kind of rethinking.
Yeah, I have two. I mean, a two-parter to this one. So one is the fact that you mentioned this idea of the long question. Now, between the two of us, we constantly have this discussion that the long question, more often than not, comes from a problem, like an idea of what you kind of have, that something that kind of irritates you at the back of the head, which helps you kind of develop this question. So the first question is, how do you if a student arrives from a position where this problem is very concealed or very hidden, or I wouldn't say non-existent, I think, or maybe non-existent, I don't know, all three of these possibilities, what are some of the tools, pedagogical tools, do you think we have today to kind of unearth these problems for these students so that they can start forming these long questions?
So it's very interesting. Actually, the very first year of architecture, when the students come in,
Yeah.
one of the courses, and this actually Prasad takes that course. He gets them to write a 200-word question.
Okay.
You because you need to learn how to ask questions in the first place. You do not, in your all through your education, you are not you are not taught to ask a question. You
Yeah.
are taught that this is your textbook, you learn from it, you learn things by heart and gum,
Yeah.
and you reproduce them, right?
we
But
want
there
to
is
talk to your students, because we are basically, this whole podcast thing is basically that we don't know what questions to ask, so we talk to people.
Yeah.
no, I mean, it's important, right? Like the
Yeah.
conversation that happens, like you learn to ask a question, right?
Yeah.
And it's only when you learn to ask a question, that's when you open up an entire space of rethinking what you've come from.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, where you come from, you've taken it as a given,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
When you ask a question back to yourself, that's when you realize, where is it that you're coming from and where is it that you're going.
Yeah.
I think that's like super important. And all through then the 5 years, we kind of you develop a kind of pedagogical framework where you ask questions. So I'll give you another example. In the second year,
Mhm.
we do this project where we ask, instead of giving a project of designing a school or a whatever, a library, we ask, what is a home, or what is a school, or what is a library. So you're asking ontological questions to a particular, so you have to rethink.
Yeah.
You have to, and then again, a kind of very very structured framework, a methodology that the studio kind of goes through also. You look at tracing the genealogy, for example, of the library. Where did that library come from? What were the structural, the spaces and how were they generated? Where did they come from? Right? And so when you start looking at that genealogy, when you start tracing that and asking a question for this, and of course also other kinds of texts, you start reading, you read Foucault, you start looking at where is the institution coming from, questions of power that gets generated. So when you start, if you are able to think through this kind of logic of where these spaces come from, why are they coming, why are they in particular ways, that's when you're able to intervene.
Yeah.
You are able to bring your own kind of understanding. Either you're trying to rethink certain ways in which spatial configurations happen. You
Mhm.
are trying to rethink ways in which certain kind of relationships get formulated. Are there spatial ways in which those are implicated, right? So
Yeah.
when you ask those questions, that's when you are able to intervene within that. And all through the 5 years, then each year we kind of have a certain question. In the second year, it's more about kind of historiography, building a certain historiography, asking a question about an institution. In the third year, it's bringing in questions of the environment, rather than saying it's a formula, this is what sustainable buildings are. You ask back a question, what is the environment, where is it coming from? In the fourth year, it's about new emerging urbanism, like what is this kind of new city that is being generated, what is this new emerging urbanism, and then you kind of intervene within that. Fifth year, the question of futures, there's a
Yeah.
question about where is it that we're leading to. So what is the material that you have to understand where we are, and how is the way that you can project a future that kind of evolves, 20 years from now, where will we be? So there's
Yeah.
a future studio. And then, of course, there is the thesis studio, which is really kind of starts with asking a question.
Yeah.
You formulate a question in the beginning of the semester, and then you take that question through. But one thing is important, that we make sure that it is a spatial question that you're asking. You're
Okay.
not kind of, and that's where it's you're not a sociologist, you're not a chemist, you're not a biologist, but you're an architect who's asking a spatial question, so that framing of the question becomes important. So I think all through those 5 years, the school, the pedagogical framework itself has been structured to be able to ask that question, and somehow try to answer things from within that.
So then, when you say that this question has to be a spatial kind of a question, right? I tend to go back to another conversation where I think in a presentation you had mentioned how, as architects, we have to approach the people we have to engage with not as architects. Like, this idea of
Expert.
not being an expert, or like as a friend, or someone who shares a certain compassion towards what they are looking at. So then so actually the question is, where does then the idea of expertise stand? I think that is something which we were very curious about. Is where does this idea of expertise stand? Because by the time you reach a fifth year thesis studio, you're already there with your skills, right? Like, those have kind of reached a certain point. I always looked at it as the thesis studio being a sort of consolidation of whatever has been learned, to now say, okay, this is where I want to um, put forth. So there are, I think for me, we're just trying to understand, where does expertise lie then, from this point going forward, uh, taking into account what you say about the idea of uh, a sort of sense of inculcated compassion with which we must engage with
and negotiate
or
and
negotiate with someone we
Mhm.
see outside, or who we approach outside.
Yeah. So again, I would say, I mean, there are two different things. One is, I mean, what you're saying, in terms of compassion, or I mean, that's kind of you kind of place the idea of architecture, cities, space in a kind of set of relationships, and
Yeah.
that's something we constantly argue, that in some ways it's really, when you're talking about space, it is implicated in life.
Yeah.
And when you think of type, when you think of architecture and typology or
Mhm.
architectural type, it is implicated in life.
Yeah.
Right? There are certain kind of spatial structures, certain spatial configurations create certain kind of behavioral logics.
Mhm.
Right? And that's where it's connected to life.
Mhm.
Okay.
Right? So when you talk about expertise, it is really about understanding, and that's what we say. It's really this kind of expertise of crafting space.
Okay.
Crafting space, but also understanding that crafting space has logics in kind of ways in which we behave. And then it's connected to life. So
Yeah.
which is why it's important to understand life, and how it's implicated in relationships, in compassions, in friendships. And if you understand that,
Yeah.
then you also understand space in a broader way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That it may not be only an object that you're designing or a building that you're designing. It's that's why it's space.
Yeah.
And that's exactly some of those examples that we spoke about.
Yeah.
That if really kind of it's about life, then what is the type that generates a certain behavior, and
Yeah.
then what is the kind of space that you create.
Yeah.
So then you don't limit yourself, because otherwise it's really kind of, you as experts, you learn how to design a building, right? So when
Yeah.
you're given a school to design, you would say, okay, I'll go to the standards, time saver standards. I'll say should be the classroom, that's the size of the classroom, that's the number of students I have to fit in. I need access to it. I need,
Yeah.
it has the plot boundary, it has so much setbacks, place, blah, blah,
Where have you placed the toilets?
Yeah.
Where
And
have to place the
can no, this was the question. No, can you get a dude on a wheelchair to reach the toilet in your building?
fine.
That's
That's important. It's
Yes.
of
important.
course it's very important, but
But the problem is that it comes from a certain structured way
yes.
of thinking. But maybe that school is something else altogether,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not that building. Maybe it is a very small building and a kind of network space in the city. Maybe it is a way of thinking of more kind of disaggregated kind of ways of
Yeah.
thinking, right? So I think, and that's where the ontological question becomes important.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
asking what is a school, rather than looking at a given or even certain, learning from certain precedents.
Yeah.
You learn from an award that is won somewhere,
Yeah.
and that becomes the precedent to work with, and then you kind of have a case study of that project, and you
Yeah.
kind of try and replicate that.
Yeah.
Instead, if you're asking that question, your answer will never come from there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It comes from the specificities of the question that you've asked,
Yeah.
right?
I think
And that's the space, and I mean, just to kind of,
yeah.
there are lots of, like, for example, Lefebvre is very, very interesting. I mean, that's where the whole idea of production of space, right? That
Yeah.
space is produced, it's not given,
Mhm.
right? And that's where this idea that, um, I'll just give you a small example, and maybe we can come back to it later again. We curated this exhibition called Venice Space, okay,
Mhm.
at the
Yeah.
Jawahar Kala Kendra.
Yeah.
And that's when it was an architecture exhibition. We were invited. There was, this very interesting person, Pooja Sood, who was the director. She's kind of working with, she's the director of Khoj now, but at that time she was
Ah.
the
Mhm.
Rani in the Jawahar Kala Kendra for a couple of years. And she invited us for this exhibition. She said it should be an architecture exhibition. And we said, I mean, again, from this idea of rethinking frameworks, we said you cannot have an architecture exhibition which is bringing projects,
Yeah.
because that's how conventional architecture exhibitions are. You have models, you have drawings, and you kind of bring projects to the table to discuss and look at case studies and precedents, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Instead, we asked the question, we said, the title was When is Space, which is kind of a short for When is Space Produced?
Yeah.
And then we invited not only architects, but we invited people who we call spatial practitioners.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
these were artists, these were architects, these were mathematicians and game designers. There were anthropologists, all of those who were implicated in the production of space, or in some ways nudging the production of space. And then there's like all kinds of, and of course, I mean, it's a long, we can come back to the discussion. There was a series of provocations that we gave each of them, of really kind of thinking of what does it mean. It was located in Charles Correa's building, so there were two kinds of provocations. One came also from Jaipur, the city of Jaipur itself.
Yeah.
The first time that a city like that was getting formed. The first sort of a gridded city. Before this, in North India, there was no city like that. There was Mohenjo-daro, but it wasn't discovered yet. But it was Savai Jai Singh sets up the city, and it is he realizes that the kind of agricultural taxes are not coming anymore from agrarian land. So he sets up this new city of traders, new people coming in, completely different building type, which is kind of morphing public and private, and creating these new kinds of streets or new public life that is emerging. So there's certain sort of an idea of sort of principles of thinking of space coming from there. Correa himself also, his own principles of space, which in many ways completely overturn a lot of givens. So for example, when he is given a mall to do, he will completely rethink it. No, it's not the glass mall anymore, but it's a completely new type. And so even the house, for example, is a completely new house. He says as much space as that you need inside, you need that much space outside. So he's also completely kind of rethinking space. So these two became the kind of hinge points, and they became the kind of, so what we like the central space of the exhibition. Instead of bringing models and drawings from Korea, we commissioned a game designer, a product designer, to make spatial tools, spatial games. Spatial games. So learning from Korea's design principles, they made spatial games, and all kinds of people were involved in that. It was a central kind of double-eyed space in Jawahar Kala Kendra. There were kids who were playing with the games, and But through the process of playing games, we were thinking of the design principles. And at the same time, the Jaipur room was also asking this question, that before cartography comes in, how are these buildings made? All these sophisticated buildings that you have in Jaipur, if you look at it, they didn't come from cartographic drawings. Okay. So we actually went to the city museum, and we saw the kinds of drawings that were there to build these buildings. And this is like post that 1890, you have Swinton Jacob, who is also coming from in Jaipur. He's there for like 30 years after that, making the Jaipur portfolio. And this is when he's actually making cartographic drawings of all the buildings and elements in this place. Before this, nobody has made cartographic drawings, but you have the most sophisticated buildings. Okay. Where is this thinking coming from? Where is this imagination coming from? And that's where we discovered, actually super interesting, in the Jaipur, there's a very, very interesting archive in the palace, in the city palace. They had these drawings, and there was one which was called the Manoharpur Palace. And that drawing was actually it was their working drawing. It was a kind of almost like a miniature painting, where the plan, the section and elevation were all collapsed. There were small notations, some of them were poems, some of them were like, instructions to others. So much itna mal, it's so much mal, then so much kind of money will go into kind of the transportation space, right? Yeah. And so these are kind of conversations, little notations to other people. Now you realize then that there is no single architect, that there are multiple architects. I would get this as somebody who's making this window. I would work with the proportioning systems that are there kind of inherent in my own body. And I would make this. So I am a kind of part designer. There's another part designer. There's another. So you have multiple people who are designers. It's only when Stephen Jacobs makes this cartographic drawing, that's when it becomes the way of thinking. And now all of us, you go to, you do measure drawings, that has become the way of thinking.
Yeah.
Right? We all make drawings like Swinton Jacob made them, but they don't become our ways of thinking. Right?
Yeah.
And that also congealed the idea of the single architect, right? Like you produced one drawing was produced by that one person who became the hero architect, who would then give instructions. So then the rest of the people who are producing the building are labor.
Yeah,
Right?
it's such a nightmare when these instructions are not followed, I must say.
Yeah, exactly. But that exactly, right? It's a nightmare when the instructions are not followed because you've set up a whole structure where somebody is subordinated. Why are they interested in what you're telling them to do? Right?
Yeah.
So it overturns. And that's again a kind of, it was super interesting to understand that what we have taken as given has come from completely somewhere else.
Yeah.
And this conversation, it's a long conversation because there's so many interesting discoveries that happen.
And then let me interrupt you there, because how much has it disrupted gender roles? You studied in the 90s in Mumbai in an architecture school, and I'm guessing it was still a time where the classroom was dominated with male students, or not? And then how has it changed now?
It wasn't dominated. It was,
okay.
At the time it was, I think already things had started. Chirag, in your class, did you have more women students?
We had way more. We had a 50-30 ratio. I remember it was 50 girls.
For us, yeah, 23 and 17. So the shift had already started.
Okay.
I think then, right? But I think one is important. You asked the question, and that's really sort of an important sort of part of the work as well. That in some ways, kind of thinking of gender and space. Often there are simplistic ideas of that we kind of come up with spaces for women, and these are very sort of docile kind of ways of thinking. Safe spaces for women. Of course, you need to have safe spaces, but you need safe spaces for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Instead, I think what is important to think of is the structural logics through which spaces are generated that are patriarchal. So the structural logic of the space itself, rather than spaces designated or allocated, right? And I'll give you another example, and it probably is a continuation of the earlier conversation of how architecture is produced, how space is produced. So I'll give you an example of there was a tribal settlement very close to Mumbai, so it's almost like 2 hours away from Mumbai. And what is interesting is that there was these spaces were actually built, and that's something that's very interesting in a kind of tribal settlement. There is a inherent equality. It's a kind of classless, casteless society. There is a kind of inherent gender equality, I would say, right? And you see that in the production, in the kind of production of space, in the idea of the everyday. So, for example, a building would be made by both men and women. Like while men would probably make the structural system, the women would make the walls. Like Bottle and Daub, for example, women are experts in making the walls. They would make the floor and all of that. Now, when the modern state comes in, with its policies, there is the Indira Awas Yojana, for example, that says that if you make buildings out of what they consider kacha, the kacha buildings, it's irrational for them, because these buildings have to be remade every 2 years.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so they will not give any funds for that. Right? Instead, if you make buildings out of brick and mortar, you will give funds for that. No? So then, of course, the villagers are not, they're not naive. They will take the money because you're getting it, right? They'll take it. They'll build those buildings. Sometimes it's impossible to live in those buildings because you're so used to spaces that are much more breathable. They will make small buildings that are, for storage. but they'll use the funds to kind of go and repair the rest of the buildings. But often what happens is that you, like, in that some of those buildings that get built, the relationships change completely. Now that brick and mortar building can't be built by people themselves. You need to have a contractor. Now that contractor is male. Okay, it comes with certain frameworks of thinking. So you would have a kind of reproduction of a space that is made through that. So you would have a living room space and bedroom or small room kind of spaces, which never existed in the earlier form, right? Which was much more fluid and allowed many more fluid relationships. So I'll give you one example. In a building like this that was made by this kind of male contractor, it was a room, and then there were a series of rooms. The kitchen was also one of those standard rooms, right? It was like one tiny space with certain width and a kitchen platform, counter, and all of that. And it's supposedly the modern kitchen. Now, impossible. It changes relationships completely because now only one person is able to work in this. Whereas the kitchen in this society worked completely differently. There were all kinds of people, men, women, children, all of them were passing through the space, working together, animals kind of walking in and out of that space. What happens? This modern kitchen completely fails. It changes relationships in the first place. So what did these people do? They said, "Ye to nahi chalega," So then they extended the space. They made a large veranda at the back, which became the kitchen, which was then built with this wattle and daub, which became, kind of continued this kind of fluid relationships. So I think it's important. Of course, they were being tactical about it. But the policy in the first place did not understand that these relationships are structural relationships. They're embedded in ways of thinking of space, and it's important to think of those structurally. Otherwise, you become very like women architecture, gender and architecture becomes really about, this very, very, very superficial ideas of creating safe spaces and other things. But without understanding the structural logics that produce certain spaces, I mean, this feminist writer Audre Lorde said that you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. You require completely different tools to dismantle, and really that's what it is about, no?
Chirag and I, by the way, are at the epicenter of this is where the modern kitchen was invented, and then exported, and we have had countless conversations with Germans, and they have no idea they've exported it everywhere.
The Frankfurter Küche is the kitchen, no?
And I always bring this up in conversations, of course, not as a look what you've done thing, but it's more of a I distinctly remember playing as a really small child, almost as an infant, having memories of the kitchen because it was the most exciting spot in the house. You didn't want to sit in front of the TV for too long because you could smell. You were learning to smell things. You were learning to taste things, touch things. And I remember being on the floor of the kitchen. And now when I look at a kitchen in Mumbai, there is no floor space. There is no where your grandmother sits next to you with that very, very specific knife that is supposed to sit on the floor. The knife is supposed to sit, and you're supposed to hold it with your feet and then cut. It's at least in the Bengali thing, or the thing that you use to grind the paste that's going to go into the curry. Of course, there was a time when the chulha was also on the floor, but okay, slowly things were moved 3 feet above in the sort of logic of hygiene and germs and all of that sterilization of lifestyle, let's say. And I and I think I don't have the data on this, but I think we would have a lot more men in kitchens in India if we had those men playing on the floor with garlic pods and ginger and onion pieces, and then crying because of the tears. And we would have a lot more men in kitchens, and a lot more men that know how to design a kitchen in India. if we didn't have we had better kitchens, let's say. I mean, there's something structural about this. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of mention that. I
No,
guess.
we talk about this constantly. Is how the Frankfurter the okay, the because this also brings me to a so in my thesis, what I was looking at was the structuralist project, right? Like what happened after what Levi Strauss and others wrote in this sort of early, like post-war period, right? And there were these there were the Dutch structuralists. There was Aldo van Eyck, Herman Hertzberger, and all these people who sort of advocated a move away from traditional formal principles of design. And they said the way to do it is to import underlying structures from, let's say, lesser known civilizations, or I would say civilizations of yore, like somewhere in Morocco or somewhere in
Something
India.
tried and tested.
Something tried and tested, apparently. And then once you import that structure and then you build something which with modern elements on top of it, it kind of creates it would create a harmonious, peaceful form, so to say, that would produce those kind of effects. That in essence is what I understood as the project itself. The kitchen is the of course the project kind of fails because of this, right? Because of this idea that there can be an underlying structure which can just sit and make things fit into something or the other. And the kitchen works in the opposite way, like this, right? Like, because this travels from the west to the east in a way, and kind of start showing how he mentions that we lose this culture of the paste of the masala, or the cutting of the knife with the
I mean, we don't want to be nostalgic for the sake of it, but there are very, very specific. I mean, just fitness, like I spending a lifetime getting off and on a chair versus getting off and off the floor. Compare the Japanese, compare some other cultures. These are really major changes. This is not a joke that you will never think about sitting down, squatting on the floor ever in the space that you call your home. These are really major changes.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, I'm just like the thing, and that's where I think for us the field becomes important, because then you kind of learn from the field and work, rather than kind of importing things from other places. And of course, you're learning from other places, but the field kind of becomes important. And I think just to kind of talk about the kitchen, Chirag, like the Sindhis, actually, the Sindhis, when they came, post partition in Mumbai. Actually, there was in Chembur, there were places, housing societies, where they kind of settled, where there were no kitchens in the house. The street became the kitchen. So series of sort of food places that get generated, where the kitchens were actually outside. And imagine what they would do to kind of gender relationships. You are not required to kind of, you don't require one person to be in the kitchen and cook, and there's a whole kind of life that gets produced. And I mean, talking about other cultures, looking at a lot of Eastern cultures, there's a whole sort of life that gets generated out of eating out. So in some ways, and this is exactly where I was talking about the idea of the city becoming home. Is it possible to start thinking of the idea that cities become night markets, for example, like whole kind of, I know China has so many municipal eating places where you get cheap food in a kind of municipal market, right? So there's a whole culture of eating out, and that structurally changes who is required to be sitting at home and cooking, and kind of spending your kind of affective labor in some ways in sort of producing certain life for that family. right? Like, and you would be doing other things in that time. So, I mean, otherwise you're seen as this bad person who's, not keeping the house,
Yeah, yeah,
place, and but if you are able to change those structural logics itself, now of
yeah.
where time is spent, how time is spent, what are the spaces in the home, the neighborhood, the city. I think there's a lot to be kind of thought
Unpacking.
of
Yeah.
there itself, and that's where you kind of structurally think of a kind of social space.
Yeah, I mean, I might be taking a very weird jump towards a entrepreneurial logic here, but when now that you mention it and I think about it, in Mumbai, Guru Kripa is very famous for its catering and its samosas and all these things. They are based from sort of Chembur. Like I was just thinking of it like if you are doing it on the street, a kitchen on the street, what it also does is it puts on display something. What goes on inside the confines of the home, what gets cooked, you put that on display on the outside. Let's do a fictional story, right? Maybe there was that Sindhi family was cooking and people were like, man, this smells really good and I need to eat this. And that's the beginning of a entrepreneurial venture over there. That's where maybe Guru Kripa was born or something like this. But it comes from these kind of logics, right? What you put out on display and how these things start to enter into entrepreneurial
Or how the
spaces,
city makes it
or how the
possible.
city, so
There's
basically the city
there's
is
no
producing
prediction
this, right?
game
If the
even.
city produces a Golkappa, it also produces a Guru Kripa. There's no Guru Kripa in Pakistan
Sindh.
anymore, or from Sindh, like from where
Yeah.
these
We
people come.
bring it
That's here.
from centuries of
Yeah, no,
wisdom.
there is yeah, I mean, that's true. I
But
completely agree.
for me, and our conversation, for the sake of our conversation, it's always uh, we do want to think about expertise in terms of, for us it's always a curatorial uh, a curatorial exercise. So when we say precedence, we every architect almost has a little micro library in our own heads, and I want to preserve that possibility, because I don't like what Google throws up all the time if I have to look for something. So expertise, architectural expertise for us has become a way of choosing and discarding precedents. Discarding per project, or per, per that long question that we spoke about earlier. And that is where the expertise for us lies, because there is no reason to, okay, I don't want to get into the depth of that conversation, but to give you an example, let's say if we were to read an essay by Heidegger in the school here, inadvertently there would be a professor that would say, be careful, he was a Nazi. It's like, I don't know, what do you want me to do? He's not exactly saying anything about murdering people on this in this essay. He's talking about something that I want to explore as a thought exercise. This whole idea of picking by or stay saying things like we're standing on the shoulders of giants and all of, it's all true. We're not discarding precedents for the sake of it, but how do you decide or negotiate value and relevance per that long question, if that long question itself has not been accepted, which is why we have such let's say, resonance with your work, with Bard Studio, and also your academic work, because for us it's always the fact that there is a longer question underneath is itself not common to the profession we find ourselves in. And this is the choice of a precedent, the choice of a reference image, because every architectural project now begins on Pinterest officially. The choice of the image that you've made a mood board out of, or the choice of um, finishes and color palettes and all of that. I want to know how this was chosen. I don't want to really jump into what it's going to do, what it means, how it's going to be, unless it has something to do with why this was chosen for its, let's say, ontological or conceptual basis. So that is part of the ontological question of what is a home, and the process of selecting those things.
And also expanding those precedents,
Yeah.
no?
Yeah.
Expanding the kind of realm, and that's why we talk about space, right? Like, and that's what Lefebvre actually also very interestingly in there's this book called Architecture of Enjoyment, actually, where he's actually talking to architects and he's expanding he's saying it's not um, the kind of art. He's expanding the spaces of architecture, saying that it does not have to be a building, it can be landscape, it can be kind of spaces around you, so you expand the precedents. You don't kind of limit themselves to,
Yeah.
the kind of objectified buildings that you could then, copy and paste in various
Yeah.
places. But what are the spatial logics? Expand those, expand the precedents.
Yeah, shelving things into sort of categories and sections. And I have the biggest for my PhD. I often I the sort of conceptual arguments that I'm trying to make and require me to look into both Peter Eisenman or let's say Aldo Rossi and such characters, and including Sana from Japan. And I'm not trying to make a sort of geographical point here, but I face so much. I guess rightly so in some ways, because of the kind of characters they were and the kind of encounters they've had with other institutions and architects in their time, that there's not a lot of sympathy for them as characters. But I'm not interested in the people. I'm looking at these works for very specific things that have complete relevance and value for me. Like, it, you cannot ignore that, and that is something I really like, that you bring it up very early to your students, that set the question, and then you won't have to worry about a checklist of things, and or worry about the game of chess that you have to play on a design studio with a professor. It's like, okay, you did this, but this doesn't work. Checkmate.
No, I think actually I just want to you mentioned, so there are a couple of terms that this sort of conversation today we've kind of kept going back and forth to. One is the idea of the negotiation itself with what we encounter and what are the forces or the transactional the capacities that are at play. The other one is the idea of the structural logics, right? Like we keep discussing that we have to go, and that's what we have to see now. And then space is so produced, right? We use this very interesting term. Space is okay. This is again a language related question. Why is space produced and not invented? You know what I don't know if I'm being very cryptic over here, or but
Yeah, but this one's heavy, man. This requires a whole podcast of its own.
no, because the logics need to be discovered, right? Or these logics you kind of keep discovering there. They are there. They are not something that you go there and you like look at it. But okay, I mean, yeah, maybe that's for
I don't know.
another.
Yeah, no. Like,
I
how
don't
long
know.
have we gone so far?
I
Already
don't know.
1.5 hours, no?
Yeah.
I
No, but this is a heavy one.
yeah.
I just thought maybe.
No, but I don't know. Does Rupali, do you want to say something, or do you think we should?
I think it will be a whole conversation. I mean, it will be a
Okay,
whole
ठीक है, no worries.
we kind of want to pick one last thing that
Yeah.
actually should be a bit lighter, but Chirag and I were laughing about it, and because that's how we also read the world, because we are not in Mumbai. so we have to rely on the internet a lot. Where do you see, what other forms of, outside of the real city that you live in, what is a good place for you to observe the city? Is it are they museums? Are they films, movies, theater? Anything that crosses your mind that wouldn't that we wouldn't normally think of as a place to observe these transactions that you speak of, where somebody tries to show them. A movie director will try to show it in those whole series of 90s movies, Vastav and the Ram Gopal Verma movies, and showing these places as real transactional spaces with their own sort of things going on, or theater where some of this gets maybe amplified, or other forms of art, or I don't know, outside, instead of being on the field, is there a virtual field somewhere that you also like to refer to?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, films for sure. There are lots of people who have, worked with this idea of the. I mean, there are some who kind of take things for given. I mean, and almost sort of reproduced, a certain singular kind of idea of cities, of spaces. But then there are others who kind of really kind of open up the complexities, the multiple occupancies, the tenures, and really kind of enjoy those films. I mean, all right from Khosla Ka Ghosla
Oh
to
yeah.
Oe Lucky, and there's so many of these.
Yeah.
And I think more and more now, filmmakers are being sort of cognizant of these, complexities spatially of relationships through which they're building, a new kind of representation of cities. So definitely, I mean, I really kind of look forward to those. But again, there are enough that are, really kind of still kind of fixated on a certain singular imagination
Yeah.
that you begin with. So I think like those are not ones that I would be so excited about.
Yeah. I do enjoy every now and then that the character of a landlord is scripted in a movie, either dishing out a notice saying आपके घर पे बहुत लड़कियां आती हैं, this is not allowed, so, और बहुत लड़के आते हैं, this is not allowed, so this is your notice to vacate the property. Or in terms of collecting back rent,
3 महीने का
from
भाड़ा नहीं दिया है.
नहीं दिया है, but I have to, and some of this always I think, I mean, that's the thing with our sense of what is Indian. We spoke about this with Mukul also, that the Indian high art and sort of pop art and low art across the whole thing, you will have a landlord in Satyajit Ray film asking for rent after it's been due, and you will have a landlord in Delhi Belly.
Yes, I was just gonna
Like,
mention that is the exact film I was thinking about, but yeah.
and yeah, it's kind of much more difficult to find that as an interesting social transaction in cinema from other places. This is a Hong Kong thing, a Mumbai thing, an India thing, but not a very, very sort of Hollywood thing for some.
But I think that's the same thing that happens in films as well. Like we spoke about precedents, that something that works well, you kind of you hold on to. They become your case studies, and you replicate it. And I think that's again the question of going back, and those who are really kind of observing things around will not work with that sort of one way of seeing, but the seeing itself becomes a deep seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a kind of thickness, and there's a deep seeing that happens, and those are the films I enjoy, because they have not gone to the field and sort of brought their own ways of seeing, but they've seen the field and come back and sort of look back at themselves,
Yeah,
Yeah.
and ask new questions. That's where the idea of the thick image comes in. And I think a lot of there's a lot that to be kind of said in that, and the kind of representations that you build. So I really look forward to people who are able to engage with those kind of thicknesses and multiplicities, because you have enough, again, precedents to
Yeah.
fall back on. And again, that's the danger as much in filmmaking as there is in architecture.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Yes. Did you do you have any other questions? Because
I'm full of questions right now for myself, and I
yeah,
love the
no,
feeling.
I
I'm
love
going
that.
to have a great weekend.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. We wanted to ask you if you have any questions for us.
Yes,
That
please.
you want to.
I'm good. I would love to sit and have a drink with you all after this, but unfortunately, that's not possible.
That
Zoom call wala karte hai na?
yeah, next time, what
Yeah.
we've also said to some other guests that we've already had, and of course Rohan, Shiv Kumar, and Mukul, and some other people we'd love to speak to, that we're going to try and do this also when Chirag and I can figure out how to get to India together at the same time, basically.
Yeah.
And that would be really amazing to have a sort
और
of
तभी वो माइक चलेगा.
हम चलाएंगे उस mic को.
We sit in the kitchen and have this conversation.
Yes,
Yes, and
absolutely.
it'll be great. It'll
Yeah.
be challenging to follow this up for us and to figure out how to ask better questions. But that is precisely why we're doing this, and we'll figure something out.
Yeah.
It'll be a scam, but we'll make it a good one.
Yeah.
Questions are always, I mean, these questions actually open, which is what I really kind of started with. What is interesting in your own practice is this idea of creating a kind of autodidactic space.
Yeah.
And I think those possibilities we have to push. We have to create more post-institutional spaces to ask new questions, and work out things, because otherwise this kind of, there's a white elephant of knowledge structures that have been produced by all kinds of things, by universities, by publications, and all of that have
Stock
created a
markets.
certain sort of almost this kind of religious space of knowledge that cannot be questioned.
Sacred
And
infrastructure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's the post-institutional space will rupture that. And I
Yeah,
think we
yeah.
need to do that.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is there wouldn't be a better moment than this to say thank you so much for doing this, Rupali. It has been an absolute pleasure, and we've had a blast. I mean, I can see his face, and I can say from
It's
that.
going to be a good weekend. I
Yeah.
must confess.
Yeah, we hope that you also enjoyed this conversation as much as we did, and thank you so much. Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much. And I look forward to meeting you all soon.
Yes. A request to all of you: if you like what we do, please follow us on our Instagram handle. It's broadcast.interrupted. That's where we put up news and updates about all our upcoming conversations. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, subscribe, share. I can keep going on and on. But yeah, most importantly, let us know what you think.